She was 22 and broke. No family to fall back on, no savings, just a canvas rucksack and $1 she had left after paying her last week of groceries. And with that $1, she bought a forgotten wool mill on a brook in the Green Mountains of southern Vermont, in a village in Windham County that had not seen a working loom or a dye vat since 1963. The fieldstone walls had gone dark with moss. The water wheel had ceased. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the dye vat room of that old mill was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Willa Pennock had grown up with color in her hands, not paint, not ink, not the clean manufactured color that came from a tube or a bottle, the living color that came from a plant. The deep gold of goldenrod, the russet of black walnut hulls, the soft gray blue of indigo, the pale rose of madder root soaked for 3 days in an iron mordant. Her grandmother had taught her to see these colors the way other grandmothers had taught their grandchildren to see wildflowers or constellations, or the rings inside a cut tree, as a language written by the natural world that a person could learn to read if she was patient enough to look. Her grandmother's name was Marjorie Pennock, and she had been a wool dyer at the Haskell Mill in the village of Waitsboro, Vermont for 34 years. Marjorie had been born in 1937 in a small farmhouse on a hill road above Waitsboro, the daughter of a sheep farmer named Virgil Pennock, who had run 60 head of merino on 200 acres of rocky upland pasture, and who had sold his fleece every spring to the Haskell Mill, which was the only working wool mill left in Windham County by the time Marjorie was born. Virgil had sheared his own sheep, 60 fleeces a year, each one rolled and tied and loaded into the bed of his truck and driven down the hill road to the mill on the brook, where the mill owner, a man named Asa Haskell, paid him by the pound and processed the wool from raw fleece to finished yarn on the same machinery his grandfather had installed in 1889. Marjorie had gone to work at the mill at 17 in 1954, hired by Asa's son, Asa Jr., to card wool to feed the raw washed fleece through the carding machine, which combed the fibers into smooth parallel sheets called bats. Marjorie had been good at carding, but the job she had wanted was in the dye room. The dye room was a small stone-walled chamber at the back of the mill, built directly over the brook so that the dyer could draw cold water from the stream for rinsing. The room held 4 stone vats, large basins carved from Vermont granite, each one about 4 ft across and 2 ft deep, set into the stone floor at waist height. The dyer stood between the vats and worked the wool through the dye baths by hand, using a copper stirring rod to turn the skeins in the hot liquid and brass color paddles, flat perforated discs on long handles, to lift the wool and check the color against the light. The dyer at the Haskell Mill was a woman named Bet Aldridge, and Bet had been dyeing wool at the mill since 1938, 16 years by the time Marjorie arrived. Bet had used only natural dyes, plant-based colors extracted from roots and bark and flowers, and lichens that grew within walking distance of the mill. She had never used a synthetic dye. She had never wanted to. A synthetic dye is a color somebody made in a factory, Bet told Marjorie on Marjorie's first day in the dye room. A plant dye is a color the mountain made. I work for the mountain. Betty had trained Marjorie across 4 years, by proximity, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of knowledge that cannot be hurried. The dye room had been Bet's classroom, and the vats had been the textbooks, and the lessons had not been written down because the lessons were colors, and colors could not be writ. They could only be seen and remembered and compared. Bet had taught Marjorie to read the dye bath the way Marjorie would later teach Willa, by looking at the liquid in the vat and knowing, before the wool went in, what the wool would look like when it came out. Marjorie had learned to identify a dye color by sight at every stage: the raw plant material in the pot, the extracted liquid before the wool went in, the wet wool in the bath, the wet wool out of the bath, the dry wool after rinsing, and the final color after the wool had cured for a week. The color changed at every stage. A goldenrod bath that looked bright yellow in the pot would produce wool that looked pale gold wet and warm honey dry. A black walnut bath that looked nearly black in the pot would produce wool that was deep russet, not black. Marjorie had learned these shifts the way a musician learns intervals, by ear, by feel, by the specific trained attention that comes from standing at a vat for 4 years watching color develop. Marjorie had also learned and this was the part that could not be taught, only discovered, that the same plant gathered from the same meadow would produce a different color depending on the month it was picked, the amount of rain that had fallen that season, the mineral content of the brook water used in the bath, and the age of the mordant. The goldenrod gathered in August produced a deeper gold than the goldenrod gathered in September because the August blossoms were at peak, and by September, the plant was putting its energy into seed rather than flower. The black walnut hulls gathered green in July produced a warmer russet than the hulls gathered brown in October. These variations were not flaws. They were the mountain's signature, the specific record of one season's weather written in the color of one skein of wool. Marjorie had loved these variations. She had called them the mountain's mood, and she had kept a sample card for each variation, which was why her sample card collection had grown across 34 years to 67 cards, instead of the 20 or 30 that a less attentive dyer would have kept. Betta had retired in 1958. Marjorie had taken over the dye room at 21 and had run it for the next 34 years, until the mill closed in 1992. She had dyed every skein of yarn the Haskell mill produced from 1958 until the end, 34 years of standing at the stone vats, working the copper rod through the hot baths, lifting the brass paddles to check the color, rinsing the skeins in the cold brook water that ran beneath the floor. She had used only natural dyes, as Bet had done. She had kept a set of wool sample cards, small squares of dyed wool pinned to index cards, each card labeled with the plant, the mordant, the soak time, and the resulting color that recorded every dye formula she had used across 34 years. The sample cards were the only written record of the Haskell Mill's dye recipes. They existed nowhere else. Marjorie had married a man named Wendell Pennock, Virgil's nephew, a carpenter who had built houses and barns across Windham County for 30 years, and who had understood that a wife who came home every evening with her hands stained gold or russet, or blue, was a wife whose work was written on her skin, and who did not need to be asked how her day had gone. Wendell had died in 2005. Marjorie had continued alone. Marjorie and Wendell had had one daughter, a woman named Shelley who was Willa's mother. Shelley had left Waitsboro at 20, had moved to Brattleboro, had worked as a waitress, had had Willa with a man who had raised Willa alone in a second-floor apartment on Main Street with the specific weary competence of a single mother working double shifts. Shelley had not been a bad mother. Shelley had been a tired mother, which in certain small towns in certain hard years amounts to the same thing. Willa had been sent to Marjorie's farmhouse every summer from the age of 5, June through August, up the hill road to the farmhouse above Waitsboro, where Marjorie kept a small flock of 12 merino sheep on the pasture Virgil had cleared, and where she had set up a hand-spinning wheel and a small dye station in the kitchen, 2 enamel pots on the wood stove and a drying rack by the window, because the mill had closed in 1992, but the dyeing had not stopped. Because Marjorie had understood that a dyer who stops dyeing is a dyer who forgets, and Marjorie did not intend to forget. Marjorie had taught Willa to card wool at 6. She had set Willa on a stool at the kitchen table with a pair of hand carders, wooden paddles with wire teeth, and a handful of washed fleece, and she had shown her how to draw the carders across each other in long even strokes until the fibers lay straight and smooth. "Don't fight the wool," Marjorie said. "The wool wants to be straight, you're just helping it get there." By 8, Willa could card a pound of fleece in an afternoon. By 10, Marjorie had taught her to spin on the wheel, drawing the carded fiber from her left hand through her fingers while her right foot worked the treadle, the twist traveling up the fiber and locking the strands together into a single continuous thread. The coordination had taken months. Willa's first yarn had been lumpy and uneven, thick in some places and thin in others, and Marjorie had held it up to the window light and said, "This is honest yarn, it's ugly but it's honest. Ugly yarn teaches you more than pretty yarn. Pretty yarn just sits there looking good. Ugly yarn tells you everything you did wrong." By 12, Willa's yarn was not ugly. By 14, Marjorie had let her into the dye pots. Willa had stood at the kitchen stove beside Marjorie and watched goldenrod blossoms steep in the enamel pot, the water turning from clear to pale yellow to deep gold across 20 minutes, and Marjorie had lifted a test skein on a wooden spoon and held it to the window and said, "What color is that?" "Gold," Willa said. "That's what it looks like wet," Marjorie said. "What will it look like dry?" Willa had no. Known, Marjorie had told her, "Warm honey, darker than the wet color but warmer with a depth the wet color did not have. The drying is where the color finds itself," Marjorie said. "Wet color is a promise, dry color is the truth." Marjorie had spent the next 2 summers teaching Willa every dye formula she knew, working through the sample cards one at a time, one plant per weekend, one color per lesson. They had gathered the plants together from the fields and woods around the farmhouse. Goldenrod from the meadow, black walnut hulls from the tree beside the barn, madder root from a patch Marjorie had cultivated at the edge of the garden for 30 years, indigo from a dried cake Marjorie ordered once a year from a supplier in North Carolina. Each plant required a different preparation. Goldenrod blossoms were steeped fresh, walnut hulls were soaked for 2 weeks in a covered bucket until the liquid turned black. Madder root was simmered slowly, never boiled, because boiling turned the color brown instead of rose. Indigo was the most difficult. It required a chemical reduction process that involved lye and patience, and a vat that smelled, Marjorie said, like a barn on a hot day. And the resulting color, a deep pure blue that no other plant in Vermont could produce, was worth every minute of the stink. Willa had learned all 67 formulas by the time she was 18. She had not learned them by reading the sample cards. She had learned them by doing, by standing at the stove with Marjorie for 4 summers, gathering the plants, preparing the baths, dipping the skeins, checking the color, hanging the wool to dry on the line beside the kitchen window, and comparing the dry result to the sample card the following week. The learning had been slow and physical and specific, and it could not have been done from a book, because the critical information, what the color looks like at each stage, how the light changes it, how the mordant affects it, how the water temperature mattered, existed only in the seeing of it. Marjorie had understood this. "I can tell you the formula," Marjorie said once when Willa was 16, "but I cannot tell you the color. You have to see the color, and you have to see it wrong before you can see it right." Willa had memorized that sentence. She had carried it through high school in Brattleboro, and through the 2 years after high school when she had worked at a yarn shop in town, and had spun and dyed small batches of yarn on Marjorie's equipment at the farmhouse on weekends. She had carried it as the one sentence from her grandmother's life that fit in her memory and told her who she was. Marjorie had died when Willa was 20. A fall on the ice outside the farmhouse in January, a broken hip, pneumonia in the hospital, and then she was gone. She had been 85. She had dyed wool that morning, a small test skein of madder root simmering in the enamel pot on the wood stove, the kitchen smelling of the warm, earthy scent that Willa would forever associate with the color rose. The skein was still in the pot when the ambulance came. Willa had taken it out and rinsed it in the sink, and hung it on the drying rack, and watched the color shift from wet rose to dry rose across the next 3 days. The dry color was deeper, warmer. Marjorie had been right. The drying was where the color found itself. The farmhouse had been sold by Shelley within 3 months. Shelley had needed the money for back rent and car repairs, and the specific accumulated debts of a woman who had waitressed for 20 years without health insurance. Willa had taken Marjorie's hand carders, the spinning wheel, the copper stirring rod from the mill's dye room that Marjorie had kept in the kitchen for 30 years, and 3 of the wool sample cards, goldenrod, black walnut, madder root. After Marjorie's death, Willa had continued working at the yarn shop in Brattleboro, a small storefront on Main Street called Green Mountain Fiber, run by a woman named Lois who sold yarn and knitting supplies, and who had known Marjorie for 20 years, and who had hired Willa at 16 because, Lois said, "Any girl who can spin yarn that even on a wheel that old has something I can't teach." Willa had worked at the shop for 4 years, stocking shelves, winding skeins, helping customers choose yarn weights, and spinning small batches of hand-spun yarn on Marjorie's wheel, which she kept in the back room of the shop. On weekends, Willa had driven Marjorie's old truck, a 1992 Ford Ranger that Wendell had bought new, and that Marjorie had driven for the last 23 years of her life, up the hill road to the farmhouse, where the 12 merino sheep were being kept by a neighbor farmer named Harold. And she had sheared 2 or 3 sheep per visit, and carded and spun the fleece at the farmhouse kitchen table, and dyed small skeins in Marjorie's enamel pots on the wood stove. She had sold the dyed yarn at the shop for $28 a skein, which Lois said was too cheap, and which Willa said was what Marjorie would have charged. And the skeins had sold out every week, because the women who bought them understood that handspun naturally dyed Vermont yarn, made by a 20-year-old woman using her dead grandmother's equipment, and her dead grandmother's dye formulas was not a product, but a continuation. She shared a small apartment above a laundromat with a woman named Dana, splitting the rent, $375 each. The arrangement ended in the spring of Willa's 22nd year when Dana moved to Burlington for a job. Willa could not cover $750 alone on a yarn shop salary. The landlord gave her 30 days. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. Tell us in the comments, have you ever watched a color change right in front of you and known that the change was telling you something? She had $1 in her checking account and no car. She had Marjorie's carders, the spinning wheel, the copper stirring rod, and 3 wool sample cards in her rucksack. She walked to the Windham County Clerk's office in Newfane the following Monday and asked whether the county had any property available for under $10. The clerk, a man in his 60s named Mr. Goss, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Under $10. Willa said, "Yes, sir." Mr. Goss pulled open a filing cabinet drawer and thumbed through a folder and said, "There's one. The old Haskell Wool Mill on Millbrook in Waitsboro. Stone building, about 2,200 square feet on a 1.4-acre parcel. Been on the surplus list since 2008. Asking price is $1. He paused. "Nobody wants it. The water wheel is seized, the roof leaks, and the county won't insure it, but it's stone, so it's standing." He looked at her. "You know the building." "My grandmother dyed wool there for 34 years, Willa said. Mr. Goss took off his glasses. "Marjorie Pennock was your grandmother. It was not a question." He stamped the deed and handed her an iron key on a loop of cotton cord. "The dye room is in the back. The vats are still in the floor." She walked from Newfane to Waitsboro, 11 miles on Route 30, through the Green Mountain foothills in late March, the snow still in the ditches, the brooks running high with melt. She reached the mill in the late afternoon. It stood on the brook exactly as she remembered it from summers with Marjorie. A long fieldstone building with a slate roof, a wooden water wheel on the upstream side seized in place by decades of ice and debris, and a heavy plank door facing the road. She put the key in the lock. It turned. One long room, fieldstone walls, plank floor, heavy timber beams, the carding machine and the loom frame still in place along the walls, dusty and still. At the back of the main room, a low stone archway led to the dye room. Bates' room, Marjorie's room. She ducked through the arch. The dye room was small and stone-walled, maybe 15 ft by 12, with the brook running directly beneath the floor through a stone channel. 4 granite vats set into the floor at waist height, each one dry and dark, stained with 60 years of plant dye, goldenrod yellow, walnut brown, indigo blue, madder rose. Colors layered on top of each other in the stone-like rings in a tree. The copper stirring rod brackets were empty. The brass color paddles were gone. Against the back wall of the dye room, behind the 4th vat, was a stone shelf built into the wall about 3 ft off the floor. The shelf held a wooden box, a simple pine box, about the size of a bread loaf with a hinged lid and a small brass clasp. The box was tucked against the wall, behind a stack of empty dye pots, invisible from the doorway. Willa opened the box. Inside, a leather tool roll containing the missing dye tools, the copper stirring rod's matching pair. The one Marjorie had taken home had been the spare. 2 brass color paddles with long handles, and a set of 3 tin pH testing spoons. Besides the tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch. And beneath both, wrapped in waxed cotton, a thick stack of wool sample cards, not 3, not 10, but 67 cards, each one pinned with a square of dyed wool, each one labeled in Marjorie's careful handwriting, plant, mordant, soak time, result. The complete dye library of the Haskell Mill. 67 colors from 67 plants. The full record. The canvas pouch held gold coins. 44 Liberty Quarter Eagles dated between 1920 and 1962. Coin dealer in Brattleboro valued them at approximately $27,000. Tucked beneath the sample cards was a folded letter. "To whoever finds this box, my name is Marjorie Pennock. I have dyed wool in this room from 1958 until today, November 3, 1992. The mill is closing. Assad Jr. says there is not enough demand for Vermont wool to keep the machines running. He is probably right about the machines. He is wrong about the wool. The wool will come back. Someone will want it again. When they do, they will need the colors. I am leaving my tools and my sample cards and my savings in this shelf because they belong to this room. The sample cards are the only record of 67. Natural dye formulas I have developed across 34 years. They cannot be replaced. The gold is what I saved. Use it for the mill. Fill the vats, dye something. Marjorie Pennock, dyer, November 3, 1992. Willa read the letter twice. Then she took a length of undyed wool roving from her rucksack, raw merino fiber she had carded herself on Marjorie's carders the previous autumn, and wrapped it slowly around her left wrist. She held her wrist up to the pale March light coming through the dye room's single window and looked at the raw white fiber against her skin. She did not cry and she did not speak. She simply held the wool against her wrist, feeling the softness of it, the lanolin still faintly present in the fiber, and she understood that what she was holding was not yarn and was not yet color. It was the beginning. It was the raw material waiting to be dyed. She said quietly to the stone walls and the four stained vats and the brook running beneath the floor, "Thank you, Marjorie, I will dye something." The next morning, she hitchhiked to Brattleboro and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Main Street. She opened a checking account and walked out into the March wind. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 1998 Chevy S10 with 189,000 mi, and a transmission that groaned in second gear, from a man in Dummerston for $1,600. The first month was the dye room floor. The stone channel that carried the brook beneath the floor had silted up with 30 years of leaves and debris, and the water no longer flowed through cleanly, which meant the vats could not be rinsed. Willa spent 3 weeks on her hands and knees in the channel, clearing the silt by hand with a garden trowel and a bucket, scooping the black muck out one trowel full at a time, and carrying each bucket up the stone steps and dumping it in the meadow behind the mill. The work was cold and wet and slow. By the end of the third week, the brook ran clear through the channel again, and when she held her hand in the water, it was cold enough to ache, which was correct, because cold rinse water set the dye and warm rinse water washed it out. And Marjorie had always said that the brook was the mill's best tool. She made the mill livable in pieces, one thing at a time, each piece earned or found or given. The first week she slept in her sleeping bag on the plank floor of the main room beside the old carding machine, using her rucksack as a pillow. The second week, she bought a folding cot from the thrift store in Brattleboro for $18 and set it in the corner of the main room near the stone archway to the dye room, where the warmth from the dye room's south-facing window reached in the afternoon. She bought a small wood stove from a farm auction in Townshend for $45, a cast-iron parlor stove, dented and blackened but sound. And Mr. Goss from the clerk's office drove up to the mill one Saturday in his pickup with a length of stovepipe his wife had found in their barn, and helped Willa run the pipe through a hole she had chiseled in the fieldstone wall. "Marjorie heated this room with a stove just like this one," Mr. Goss said, fitting the pipe sections together. "I remember the smoke coming out of that wall when I was a boy. The whole village knew the mill was working when the smoke was going." The first fire she lit in the stove, a small careful fire of birch kindling she had gathered from the woods behind the mill, filled the main room with a dry, crackling warmth that traveled across the stone floor and up the fieldstone walls, and settled into the timber beams. And Willa sat on the cot and watched the firelight move across the old carding machine and thought, this is what Marjorie saw every morning for 34 years. This light on these stones, this warmth in these beams. A woman named Mrs. Thurber, who owned the farm across the road from the mill, brought Willa a box of kitchen supplies on the third week, a coffee pot, 2 enamel mugs, a cast-iron skillet, a bag of potatoes, a jar of her own maple syrup. "Your grandmother bought eggs from my mother every Saturday for 20 years, Mrs. Thurber said. "I'm not going to let Marjorie Pennock's granddaughter go hungry in her own mill." She came back every Saturday after that with eggs and bread and whatever else she had. She never stayed long. She stood in the doorway and looked at the dye room and said, "It smells right in here. It smells like the old days." Willa set Marjorie's photograph on the stone shelf above the cot, Marjorie at the dye vats in 1974, copper rod in her hand, her fingers stained deep gold. She pinned the 3 sample cards she had carried in her rucksack to the timber beam above the archway, goldenrod, black walnut, madder root, and beside them she pinned, one by one, the 67 cards from the box until the beam was covered in small squares of colored wool. 67 shades arranged in the order Marjorie had numbered them, a spectrum of plant color running from the palest cream to the deepest indigo. Each one labeled in Marjorie's handwriting. The beam looked like a sentence written in color. It was the most beautiful thing in the building. She set the spinning wheel in the main room near the south-facing window and began taking small commissions. Hand-spun, naturally dyed yarn for knitters and weavers in the valley, who had heard from Mrs. Thurber, or from Mr. Goss, or from the woman at the yarn shop in Brattleboro that Marjorie Pennock's granddaughter had reopened the Haskell mill and was dyeing wool in the original stone vats with the original plant formulas. Each commission was small, a pound of yarn, 2 lb, sometimes just a few skeins in a specific color, but each one was a connection, a thread between the mill and the valley. She got a job in her second year. A fiber arts cooperative in Brattleboro hired her 2 days a week to teach natural dyeing workshops because the owner, a weaver named Ruth Slocum, had driven to Waitsboro to buy a skein of Willa's goldenrod yarn and had stood in the dye room looking at the 67 sample cards on the beam and had said, "This is a library. This is the only natural dye library in Vermont. You need to be teaching this." Ruth hired her at $20 an hour and told her students, "This woman can look at a dye bath and tell you what the wool will look like dry." Her grandmother could do the same thing. Nobody teaches that. It's inherited. On a clear evening in late September of her 25th year, Willa sat on the stone step outside the mill door and watched the last copper light fade across the brook. The water wheel, which she had freed from its ice and debris in her second spring, and which now turned slowly in the current, not powering anything, just turning, cast long shadows across the meadow. Inside the mill, the wood stove ticked. The spinning wheel stood by the window and the 67 sample cards glowed on the beam in the last light coming through the archway. She could smell goldenrod steeping in the dye room, a fresh batch, the first of the fall. The blossoms she had gathered that morning from the meadow behind the mill. She thought about Marjorie, who had stood at those vats for 34 years making colors from plants that grew within walking distance of the door. She thought about Bet Aldrich, who had told a 17-year-old girl on her first day, "I work for the mountain." And she thought about Virgil, who had sheared 60 sheep every spring and driven the fleece down the hill road to this building, because the wool and the mill and the mountain had been for 3 generations of Pennock's the same thing. That's the thing about the colors our grandmothers teach us to see. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and standing at a kitchen stove watching goldenrod blossoms steep in an enamel pot, that the watching is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, dye bath by dye bath. And then, 2 years after the old woman dies, we walk into a room with 4 stone vats stained 60 colors deep, and we find a box on a shelf and open it and understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that wet color is a promise, dry color is the truth, and the trade is the patience to wait for the truth to appear. Willa Pennock was 22 years old and broke. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a forgotten wool mill on a brook in the Green Mountains of southern Vermont. It was the best $1 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full quiet road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next quiet road.